Hello and welcome to the Lost Stanley Tapes. My name is Tess Nevone and I've been working on this panel for the past 2 months. Before you listen, I'd like to give a little context. Stanley visited Ithaca College in 1975 and spoke to the students and members of the community while promoting some of his work. These tapes were just rediscovered earlier this year, and this is the world premiere of the Lost Stanley Tapes. Following the tapes, we have author and Stanley expert Danny Fingeroth here to give more context on the tapes and to answer some of your questions. So stay tuned.
So tonight we have a very special guest. As you all know him very well, Mr. Stan Lee, the creator and publisher of Pop Comics, and I had dinner with him, but he would not fill me in on any secrets, so I hope now is the time to give me those big clues. Mr. Stan Lee, would you welcome?
Thank you, culture lovers. Okay, so it's secrets time. Actually, the reason I wouldn't fill him in on any secrets is I didn't know any. And I mentioned to him that what happens is you have dinner with somebody before the lecture and you answer a lot of questions. Then when you get up here, you feel as though you're repeating yourself. So you don't have to worry. I'm not going to repeat myself because I haven't said anything. And if I'm true to my record, I won't say anything now either. I'm happy about Gene Roddenberry because I was mentioning a few minutes ago. I would guess the last half a dozen or dozen colleges I've been at, you always say when you walk in, hey, who was here before me? And you hope it's going to be somebody terrible, so you'll look good by comparison, you know. And at most of them, they say, hey, you just missed Gene Roddenberry. He was here last week, you know. This is the first time I hear he's coming after me. So I want you all to say hello for me when you see him. Anyway, I do comic books. I've done them for about 3 decades now. And let's see, where will we be? First of all, I don't have really what you might call a structured speech. So let me tell you how this thing will go, and you can stop it at any point and you can interrupt and we can change the sequence, it's okay. I'll talk for a while until we both start getting bored, which will probably take 2 or 3 minutes. Then, if you're still up to it, we can have questions and answers, and that's when you really have to contribute most of the evening, because it's all up to you. I will say at one point, okay, how about some questions? And if you don't have any questions, you will see a grown man die right in front of your eyes. Because if you know what it feels like to say, are there any questions, and nobody says a word, I tell you, it's horrible. And I'll just leave you to Gene Roddenberry if that's what happens. All right, now we get over the tough part. I'll make this as fast as possible. Comics today are a very, very big form of entertainment. They've become big business. They're a very big part of the media. Now, they haven't always been this big. When I got into the business, nobody read comics except kids 6, 7, and 8 years old, a few moronic older people and servicemen, and that was it. Now, you're saying to yourself, so what changed it? What happened? How come the fact that comic books today are like the epitome of culture and social enlightenment in literary and artistic form? I'm going to tell you what happened. Is the sound of this thing okay? Because I hear 1,000 echoes. Can you hear it clearly? Unfortunately, you can hear it clearly. Okay. Years ago, comic books were not really the most sophisticated form of communication. The writing was less than 3-dimensional. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Years ago, let's take any superhero. Let's take Superman or Batman or Captain America. It could have been one of our characters or one of the competitors. It didn't matter. They were all written alike. You would see a superhero walking down the street, let's say in New York City, and he'd have on his little colorful long underwear suit and his little booties and his little mask, and nobody would notice him. Just be walking down the street. Now he'd turn a corner and along would come a bug-eyed monster. You know, something about 20 feet tall with 6 arms and 12 eyes and tentacles and scaly skin, and the monster would be walking down the street like this. You know? and the hero would see the bug-eyed monster. And this is the way the dialogue would go. Our hero would say something like, "Oh, a creature from another planet. I had better destroy him before he captures the Earth." Now, I want you to understand that was amongst the best dialogue that was being written in those days, because the writers weren't really concerned with realism, with relevance, and with truth in advertising. I would like to feel that today, if a similar situation arose and one of our heroes was walking down the street and saw a bug-eyed monster, the dialogue might be something like, "Who's the nut in the Halloween outfit? I wonder what he's advertising." At which point, the bug-eyed monster would seize the hero, destroy him, and capture the Earth. But at least it would have been written in a literary way. Basically, for the first 20 years of the comic book industry, the writers were very conscious, and the editors and the publishers and the artists were very conscious of the fact, at least they felt, nobody is reading their stuff except little kids who didn't really understand any word with more than one syllable, and what's the difference? No publisher paid enough money to really get a fairly good or capable or competent writer. The artists, for the most part, were much better. The artwork was always a little bit better than the quality of the writing. Now, this went on for years and years. There was never any fan mail. There was never any feedback. It's like if you do a radio show, unless you do the kind of show where you get a telephone calls and the audience calls in, and it's that sort of show, you never really know if anybody's listening. I had done some in the past, and it's the funniest feeling. You're talking into this mic and you see an engineer in the sound booth who's reading Playboy or something, and you're talking, and for all you know, there isn't a human being in the world listening. You're just talking, and that's the way we felt in the comic book business. We were turning out stories. We figured somewhere some kid this big is reading the stuff, and that was it. No feedback. Maybe once a year we'd get a letter from somebody, and it would run like, "Dear editor, I got one of your books and there was a staple missing in the binding. I want my 10 cents back." That's what they cost those days. We would take that letter and we'd show it around the office. "Hey, we got a letter, a fan letter, you know?" And we'd hang it up on the bulletin board. We got a letter. Well, finally, after about 20 years of this, I might mention that I always thought my job was temporary. The reason I called myself Stan Lee, which was my first name, Stanley Cutton too, was I wanted to save my real name for the great things I was going to someday write and not waste it, just on comic books. So I figured, well, I'll stay in comics for another few months, make a couple of bucks, then I'll get out and write the great American novel. And after 20 years went by, my wife said to me one day, "Hey, Stan, you're kidding yourself. I'm beginning to think this is a permanent job for you. Why don't you try to give it a little more application?" Because in my spare time, I was writing television shows and radio and advertising and newspaper stuff, whatever I could do, and I wasn't spending one extra second thinking about the comics. What I did from 9 to 5, that was it, and then I forgot it. So I figured, okay, maybe she's right. We had an artist at that time named Jack Kirby, who had been doing, and I want to have news for you about Jack Kirby at the end of this, if you remember. Questions and answers period. Somebody please say, "Hey, what's happening to Jack Kirby?" Okay? No. So Jack had been doing a lot of these crazy monster stories. That's what we were specializing in at this time. I'm taking you back now to the year 1960. Up until this time, our comics had been cyclical. They worked in cycles. One year, Westerns would be big, so we'd turn out 10 Western books. Another year, the funny animal stuff would be big, and we'd have a lot of things like Terry Tunes and Looney Tunes and Schmooney Tunes and all that kind of stuff. One year, there'd be mystery stories that were big. Well, this was the year of the horror stories, and Jack and I were doing imperishable literary works such as Fatum, the monster from the 12th dimension, or Grogur, the dragon that devoured the earth, and other enduring bits of memorabilia. And nobody was paying any attention. So one day I walked into Jack and I said, "Hey Jack, I was talking to my wife." Now that's not a newsworthy item. I often talk to her, but what I meant was she suggested, why don't we try something different and this and that. And Jack, who is not one of the world's great conversationalists when he's working, he hides behind a big cigar, and he was drawing, he went, which is, for Jack is a long conversation. So I took that to be an affirmative remark. And I said, let's try something really new. Let's get away from these little monster stories. Now, I had just learned at that time that National Comics was producing the Justice Society of America, or the Justice League or something like that, and that was their best-selling book. So I said, you know, maybe we ought to try some superheroes and let's do a team, because maybe that's the new trend. But let's do it differently than comics have ever been done before. So Jack said, "What do you mean?" Which was a long speech for Jack. And we talked it over and we decided that unlike all the comics up to that point, where the good guy always wore a white hat and he never did anything wrong and he was 100% good and smart and infallible, and the bad guy was always totally bad and evil and sinister and he always got caught at the end, we would do it differently. And also in superhero teams, the heroes were always friendly. They got along well together, and they loved each other. And the hero would always pat his little teenage sidekick on the head and say, "Well done, sidekick," and so forth. We would change that. So we came out with a group called the Fantastic Four. And Jack Kirby, thanks you. And in the Fantastic Four, we had one hero who was the world's smartest scientist, which is enough to make you hate him on sight right there. He also developed a rather unique property. His body stretched at will and then contracted. We'll get into that later. No, maybe we won't. Then, instead of having a girlfriend who was the typical ingenue of one of these stories, and it doesn't sound so radical now, but in those days it was earth-shattering. I said, "Hey, Jack, let's let him be engaged to this gal." So he actually had a fiancée, and they were going to get married. And she developed the rather singular quality of being able to become invisible at will later on, too. So then she had a kid brother, and the kid brother was going to be the teenage sidekick, except we didn't make him as sweet and lovable as, let's say, if you'll excuse it, Robin the Boy Wonder. But he was sort of an itch, you know, Johnny Storm, and he was a pest to begin with, and he was always flaming on and causing a lot of trouble. Then the most popular member of the whole group was a monster called the Thing. It was a little unusual in that he had orange skin which looked like volcanic lava, and a totally hostile and belligerent nature. And we were always having situations like one of the, let's say the Thing would say, "I want to cut out of this group. Richards is hogging all the headlines and everything, and nobody's paying attention to me." And the itchy kid, Johnny Storm, would say, "I'm not getting paid enough. I'm going to join another group." And these were things that, as I say, they're not that revolutionary now, but in those days, nobody had ever done comics like that before. We were doing it just to keep ourselves awake and to see what would happen, and we never expected the results. Oh, and also, they didn't always win. Occasionally the villain got away, occasionally they trip all over themselves. We had one story where the Fantastic Four were evicted from their penthouse headquarters because they didn't pay their rent, because the leader, Reed Richards, lost all their money in stupid stock investments, all their reward money, and they wanted to throw him out of the window because they didn't take this lightly. So they get booted out of the office, and we wove that into the plot. They were offered a job by a producer in Hollywood who turned out to be the submariner who wanted to kill him, and from there on it got complicated. But it was sort of an unusual type of plot. Okay. So what happened was, now we started really getting fan mail. And the strange thing is, oh, I didn't tell you one other thing. I also said to Jack, let's not write the stuff as if it's for little kids. Let's use a normal vocabulary. If we want to use a word like cataclysmic or subliminal or antediluvian or anything, let's use it. And if a kid doesn't understand the word normally, he'll get it by osmosis, or by the use of the sentence, he'll figure it out. Or if a kid has to go to a dictionary and look it up, this isn't the worst thing that could happen. So we thought we would try that too. Well, we didn't lose one young reader. It didn't seem to affect the young kids at all, but what happened was the older readers began to realize, hey, comics really aren't for 2-year-olds. There's something here I can enjoy. And they started writing letters, and the letters were detailed and in-depth. And in your last story, there was one button missing on so-and-so's uniform, and this is, intolerable. Or how come Reed Richards said thus and such, and it's out of character with the personality that you established 2 issues ago, and he did thus and such, and it's in conflict with it, and on, and they'd start analyzing the stories in psychological and sociological terms. Well, this was flattering as hell to us, and we figured, hey, maybe we're on to something. So after that, we came up with, I think, the Hulk. Thank you. Now, in the Hulk, we were trying again to be a little different. So I figured, enough with the teams. We have a team, now we want individual heroes. How can we make a hero that's different than any other? Well, obviously, you make a villain a hero. Nobody had particularly done that before. I always loved the Frankenstein monster. I always thought he was really the good guy, and these nuts who ran around with torches and tried to kill him, they were the bad ones. All the Frankenstein monster wanted was what we all want. A little love, a little understanding, a little affection. Occasionally a dead bird whose neck he could squeeze, but, he was like any of us. And he was misunderstood. So I figured, let's get a guy like that. We'll call him the Hulk. And it went on, and we created him in the usual way. There was a gamma ray explosion, and it affected his skin, and this and that. It happens every day. So he became the Hulk, and he grunted, and he growled, and he'd say, Hulk strong, Hulk will kill, and other bits of imperishable dialogue. He caught on too. Now, the funny thing is, I thought I was being very serious. And the readers thought that these stories, I don't know what gave them this idea, they thought these were satirical stories. And I began to get a reputation for being a satirist. Well, you know what happens with people? When you tell them something, they try to live up to it. So now I tried to write satirical stuff, which was almost my undoing. And I figured, all right, I'll come out with a strip that's really satirical, and I'll call him Spider-Man. Now, Spider-Man was very... Thank you. Thank you, spider lovers. Spider-Man was even more difficult to get across because the fellow who was then my publisher gave me chapter and verse as to why Spider-Man couldn't possibly make it as a popular strip. Stan, first of all, people hate spiders. Unassailable logic. Secondly, it's a dumb name. Thirdly, I never even liked the Hulk. But I decided I couldn't really get the go-ahead to put out a book called Spider-Man. So we had a book called Amazing Fantasy that we were about to kill anyway. We were doing it, it was its last issue. So my publisher didn't care what I put in the book because we were going to kill it. So I got Spider-Man out of my system. I slipped him into this book, featured him on the cover. I knew nobody would notice because nobody was buying the book anyway. Sent the book to the printer and forgot about it. And then the dam broke. We sold like 110% of what we had printed. And the mail this time was a flood. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, Spider-Man. Yay, Spider-Man. Greatest thing since ice cream. And when the mail came in and the sales figures came in, I showed all that information to our publisher, who grunted and grumbled in his beard. He hated to be proven wrong. But he said, all right, so you want to put out a Spider-Man book, but it won't last. And we put out Spider-Man, and the rest is history. Now, what happened was Spider-Man was a teenager. Nobody hates teenagers, I swear, more than I do. Nobody hates heroes more than I do. I even hate comic books. So this was everything I hated. I got to tell you about Batman and Robin. Now look, you may not believe this, but I'm a reasonably normal guy. And I'm telling you, if I were a superhero, if I had superpower, and this is not to be construed as an admission that I don't have a superpower, but if I were a superhero, can you imagine that I'd go palling around with some 15-year-old kid all my life? Wherever I went, I'm dragging a boy wonder with me. You know, at the very least, people would talk. And this is one of the reasons I hate teenage sidekicks. If you have a girl sidekick, you know, it's relevant. So, anyway, despite the way I felt about teenagers at the time, despite the way the whole world feels about teenagers, I said, let's do a strip and we'll star a teenager and we'll make him a loathsome, unbearable guy. So he didn't have a friend in the world. The guys hated him. The girls couldn't stand him. He had acne. He probably had bad breath. Everything was wrong with him. And he was our hero, Peter Parker. And again, we try to be logical and we try to be scientific in our creation of superheroes. So he was bitten by a radioactive spider. As all science students are well aware, this gave him the proportionate power of a spider, whatever in hell that means. He's now able to climb on walls and to spin a web and so on. He became tremendously popular. By now, we were drunk with power. We could do no wrong. So I said to Jack, hey, let's do a hero who's, you know, we were trying to think, how could we top ourselves? We had a guy who was the strongest mortal on earth, the Hulk. We had a teenager who crawled on walls. We had a group that, well, we've been through that. What could we do to top it? I figured the only thing is let's make a superhero out of a god. You can't beat a god. And we came up with Thor. Again, on behalf of Godhood Assembled, I thank you. Once again, my publisher said, you're out of your mind. First of all, it sounds like you're lisping. What kind of a name is Thor? And those little blonde curls of his, this was before the Beatles. Nobody had long hair. He said, you can't push a hero with long, blonde, shaggy curls. And then when he found out, he said, what's Thor's weapon going to be? Because as you know, all superheroes, you wouldn't catch a superhero without a weapon. I figured I wanted to be a little different with Thor. So when my publisher said, what's his weapon? I said, he's going to have a hammer. And he said, what's he going to do with the hammer? And I said, he's going to fly. My publisher said, how is he going to fly? Reaching for a brick. And again, you know me by now. I try to be scientific. I said, well, the hammer is the scientific and physical way because the hammer has a leather thong. And we want this to be believable and understandable. So what he's going to do, he's going to swing the hammer around by the thong. And when it's going real fast, he's going to let go like that, but hold on to the thong. Now the hammer will go spinning through the air. He's holding on to the thong, so he goes spinning after it, you see. Well, assailed by logic such as that, what could the man say? Patted me on the head and God go with you. And we came out with Thor. Now after a few issues of Thor, I felt it's still not different enough. I was really a glutton for punishment. And I said, I'm going to write this in a different style. It seems to me a god shouldn't say things like, gee, I'd like a Coke. He ought to say things like, so be it, and thou hast spoken. So I decided to write it with a phony biblical and Shakespearean turn of a phrase. And I got involved in the thous and the these and the haths and the has. And then I had his father talking that way, and I had his father, Odin, the king of the gods, say things like, I am the Word and the way and the wonder. And I began to believe all this, and I got carried away. And I'd go home to my wife, and I'd say, I want dinner, I have spoken. You know, more unbearable than ever. But Thor caught on. Incidentally, if I may be allowed a mild plug, you will find all of this material in a much more interesting and leisurely manner presented in a book that I've done for Simon & Schuster called The Origins of Marvel Comics, on sale for $5.95 in paperback or $9.95 in a cloth cover, wherever quality books are sold. And anyway, after Thor, and although I'm sure I'm wasting time telling you this, I'm sure you've all got 2 or 3 copies of it. After Thor, again, in trying to be different, I figured, let's do a magician now. We've got gods, and we've got green-skinned monsters and spiders. So we came out with somebody called Dr. Strange. Now, thank you. Thank you, lovers of the occult. The problem here was, how do you have a guy named Dr. Strange, master of the mystic arts? How do you have him talk? If he wants a villain to vanish, you can't have him say, hey, get out of here, will you? You know, that doesn't sound like a master of the mystic arts. So I had to create a whole new type of language for him. And I developed all kind of spells and chants and incantations. And I'd have him say something like, by the hoary hosts of Hoggoth, get thee gone. And I didn't know what this meant either, but I'll tell you a funny thing. And I had him wear something called the Eye of the Agamotto, which was a locket, and he'd swear by the shades of the shadowy seraphim, and, you know, nothing. I started getting more mail, mostly from colleges, and the mail would go like this: Dear Stan, I'm doing a term paper on the ancient Druid writings, and my research has led me to realize that you've based all your Dr. Strange spells and incantations on the ancient Druids, and would you please send me a bibliography, and on and on. Now, I know about as much about ancient Druids as I do about how this microphone works, but it sort of proves that there's nothing you can say or do or write crazy enough that somebody isn't going to find some logic and meaning in it, and it makes being a writer very easy. All right, then, by this time, we were now into total madness and a real ego and power trip, and could do no wrong. And I had one of my final fights with my publisher, who has been serving as my straight man for years. And he said to me, hey, you know what I don't understand, Stan? All your books are crazy. They violate every rule of what a good comic book should be. But they seem to be selling pretty well. How come? What is it? What is there about these characters? And I said, you know, it isn't the characters, I don't think. I think it's the style. Because you yourself said the characters don't have a chance. Nobody likes spiders. Nobody believes in a god with long golden curls and so forth. I said, I think what we've done is we've discovered a little style that nobody has used before. He said, no, that isn't it, it's the characters. So I said, well, I'll make you a bet. I'll take any character at all that you think wouldn't possibly have a chance. There's no way it'll succeed. We'll do it in the Marvel style, and let's see if it sells. Now, you don't know what I'm leading up to, but I'll tell you in a second. So he thought for a while. He said, okay, you're on. I said, all right, now what type of magazine today is there no way of succeeding with? What type of book couldn't you give away? He said, well, nobody is reading war comics right now. Nobody wants stories about the war. People are sick of war and so forth. And he was right. I said, okay, we'll do a war comic. Now, to make my point even clearer, I thought about it a while. I said, we'll give it the craziest name you could imagine, and the nuttiest hero. So if it succeeds, you can't say it's the title or the subject or the character. So we called the book Sergeant Fury and His Howling Commandos. Now, you know, that's no name for a book. Thank you, military operation lovers. And Sergeant Fury was a guy who was really obnoxious. He got his shirt torn off in every issue, and he was a D's and a Do's guys, and he tried to be tough, and who was he kidding, and all that. And we violated a lot of rules in this book, too, to make it twice as tough. We had the first ethnic platoon, the first ethnic group that had ever been in a comic book. We had, it was, I think, the first book that had a regular character, a serious character, about a black fella. One of the soldiers was Gabriel Jones, who was a black man, and he was one of the group's buddies and one of the troops in the platoon. We had a Jewish soldier named Izzy Cohen, and nobody ever had an Izzy Cohen in a comic book before. We had an Italian named Dino Manelli and so forth, and we tried to treat them like real people. Occasionally, like with the Fantastic Four, they'd fight and they'd argue, and there'd be guys that didn't like them and so forth. Well, when my publisher saw this, he said, not only is it a rotten idea for a book, not only is it the worst name in the world, not only is it a subject that nobody is going to buy, but you won't sell it down south, you won't sell it in Darien, Connecticut, you won't sell it in the Midwest, they'll hate it in the big cities, and I wouldn't let it into my house. All right, the rest is history. It became one of our best-selling books, and we're trapped with the damn thing. We can't get rid of it. We have tried to drop it. We keep getting letters, bring back Sergeant Fury. I don't even know who's reading it. We got so busy with other books, we don't have time to draw it, so we've been publishing reprints of it. And they're selling as well as the original stories, and I have a feeling Sergeant Fury is going to go on forever. So this, again, it led us to believe we were onto something. Now, one other thing that I'll mention, in a way, Marvel Comics is more than a lot of stories, and we learned this in retrospect. It wasn't intentional, but I was asked to deliver a talk once at J. Walter Thompson. J. Walter, what's the name of the advertising agency? Thompson. Isn't that funny? All of a sudden it sounds strange to me. JWT, J. Walter Thompson. And they wanted me to talk. And I was glad to go there. I said, fine. And I said, what do you want me to talk about? They said, we want you to talk about the way Marvel Comics is like one big advertising campaign. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, we've been studying your books, and the whole thing is a real advertising program. And they explained it to me, and I realized what they meant, and we had been doing this unconsciously. What we had done, and I guess it was part of what I referred to as style to our publisher, we had projected an image. Prior to Marvel Comics, all comics were just regular stories. They began and they ended. If there was a letters page, each letter said, Dear Editor, I like thus and such a story, yours truly, and that was the end of it. There were no editorials or anything. We had editorial pages. We had pages in which I would rap with the reader. We called it the Bullpen Bulletins page. We had a column called Stan's Soapbox. When we got mail from the readers, it wasn't Dear Editor. It was Dear Stan or Dear Jack or Hey You Two Idiots or stuff like that. And we'd answer the letters informally and kid around, and we really liked the readers and we enjoyed it, and I think it came through. And we had a lot of slogans and catchphrases. We put on the cover, Welcome to the Marvel Age of Comics, or another winner from Marvel, the House of Ideas, and a lot of modest little phrases that we would throw in, and expressions like Nuff Said and Excelsior and all kind of junk. But it was fun. We enjoyed it, the readers enjoyed it, and the whole thing became like an in thing, and it was like we and the readers were all parts of a gang, of an in crowd, which leads me to another thing that I just remembered. We started getting mail after a while. Hey, why don't you guys form a club? We want to belong to a Marvel club. Now, I had about as much time to form a club. We didn't have a minute, but the mail came in, so I said, well, there's only one way to do it. We got to make our readers happy, but we don't have time to run a club, so we'll form one, but we'll charge too much money, so nobody will join it. So we started something called the MMMS, the Merry Marvel Marching Society. And, oh, you still remember, huh? I don't remember how much it was, $1, $2 or something. A ridiculous amount in the days when clubs were a dime to join, and you got the world for the dime. We were charging $1 or $2. And all you got was a little plastic record that we had. I got to have this record. I said, we want to give something for the $1. So I marched the whole bullpen, which consisted in those days of about 6 artists and writers and 1 letterer who didn't want to go. across the street to a recording studio because I found a cheap studio where for 3 cents they'd make a little plastic record. And I said, wouldn't it be great? We'll put all our voices on a record and we'll send that to the club members and they'll hate it, but what's the difference? It's a little extra. So all these guys who are totally inarticulate, they came over there. Artie Simic, the letter, I said, I'm not going to talk. I want to play my harmonica. And I was like a shepherd, I'm leading them across the street. I'm saying, come on, fellas, please. It's only another minute. It won't hurt. It'll just take a second. By the time I got them there, I couldn't get them away. It's like anything else. They got to the microphone. I couldn't pull them away, All of a sudden, they were on stage. So anyway, we crowded these 6 guys onto the record, and which is now a collector's item if anybody has one. So we had the club, MMMS. Then later, we've recently formed a club called FOOM, Friends of Old Marvel, which we also don't know what to do with, but people have been asking for it. We got like 200,000 members. I think we can either try to take over the government or we should give them all their money back. We got these members, we don't know what to do with them. So we publish a magazine every few months that somebody in the office does, I'm not sure who. And we send them out to the club members and everybody's happy. We had a convention just last week. I'll tell you about the convention. Comics have become such a big thing that there are more and more comic book conventions in cities. San Diego has one every year. Detroit has one. There are 6 of them in Texas. There's one in New York every summer. There's a Star Trek convention. There are conventions all over the place. So one day we said, we've got to have a Marvel convention. And we had one at the Commodore Hotel just this weekend. We had like 10,000 kids, and it was the greatest thing in the world. I want to tell you, we're going to have it again next year, and you're all invited. And if you go to the desk and say that you're from Ithaca, we'll get you in for half price. So just ask for me, I'll come running out and sign a tab. You're all invited for half price. And anybody who's going to spend $100 going to New York, you ought to get in for half price. But the convention was great, but we had a bomb threat. I was in London. I was in London about 3 weeks ago, knocking them dead on television appearances. See, we publish in London, and every time we put out a new magazine, I go over there and do a few interviews and stuff to publicize it, which is the cheapest way. It's cheaper than taking advertisements. The interviews are free. So I was over there doing that, and I'm asleep in a hotel. 2:30 in the morning, the phone rings. Are you Stan Lee? And I figured, oh, these fans, they'll seek me out anywhere. I said, yeah, And the guy said, I want $45,000. I said, so do I. Who's this? And he said, listen, you're having a convention in a few weeks, aren't you? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I just put 3 bombs at the Commodore Hotel, and you better pay the money. And this was really dead serious. I got scared stiff. I woke up, I talked to him for a while, and I realized this guy isn't kidding. Now, what really scared me, he was calling from New York. He had somehow found my hotel room. He had asked for me by room. And that's a very scary feeling when you're 3,000 miles away and a guy phones you to tell you about 3 little bombs he's planted, or says he's planted. Well, the story had a happy ending because we caught him. We actually had to say we were going to give the money in, and we went to Boston and we dropped it. It really was like a movie. We may do a story about this sometime. We came to the airport and he phoned and said where to leave the money. We put it in the car. And it was very funny because a couple of New York detectives accompanied us, and there were some Boston detectives waiting at the airport because we knew the drop was going to be made then, and we hoped to catch the guys. But the New York detectives didn't know what the Boston detectives looked like. The Boston detectives didn't know the New York detectives. They're following each other around the airport. Nobody looks more suspicious than detectives. They're all a little unshaven, they don't wear ties, and they walk around, like this. So the minute the New York detectives saw the Boston detectives loitering and lurking, they started following them. The Boston detectives see these 2 seedy-looking guys following them, and they figure, they're walking around circles. In the meantime, we're dropping the money, and we're all alone. Nobody's watching us. Well, by some miracle, some cop who wasn't even tipped off to this thing grabs the guy who reaches in for the money, and just some 20-year-old kid from Worcester, Massachusetts, with 2 other 20-year-old kids that he had picked up that day to help him. And that's the whole story there, but it was scary as hell. So I thought I'd let you in on a little behind-the-scenes stuff that goes on in the exciting, dangerous, risky comic book business.
Jack Kirby. Well, that was going to be like, was he going to return, let's say, the Fantastic Four and Could?
Actually, if he should want to later, yes. But the first thing he's going to do is an entire new series, which is so radically different from anything that's out today, I wouldn't even presume to try to describe it in the few minutes we have left. Also, he's going to do a giant-sized $1.50 book based on the movie A Space Odyssey, 2001. We're going to do a giant book version of that, which I think will be kind of good. Yes. Yes, sir.
What about Captain America?
What about him?
Left him out completely.
We left him out of what? You mean out of my speech? Captain America. No. Captain America, I didn't mention him because he's not exclusively a Marvel character. He was created in the pre-Marvel days by Simon and Kirby. When I started working at the company, he had already been in existence. In fact, the first strip I wrote was one of the Captain America stories. What happened was he died after a few years. He was revived in 1940-something. He died again. When I say died, I mean the book didn't sell. They abandoned it. Then in the 1950s, we brought it back again, and there was no interest. Again, after we had launched Marvel Comics, I said to my publisher, hey, let's bring back Captain America again. And he said, you're crazy. The thing died 3 times in the past. Nobody wants him. I said, yeah, but we never did him in the Marvel style. And again, the usual argument. He said it'll never work. We brought him back. And I changed him to this extent. In the past, Captain America was just a super strong, patriotic character who fought villains and always won. I tried to turn him into sort of a Hamlet. He was always soliloquizing. He was always wondering, why am I here? Why am I doing what I'm doing? Am I not really an anachronism in a world I never made, which doesn't understand me, and so forth? And for some reason, in the crazy, neurotic world of today, it caught on. You know, the readers liked him, so he's back with us again today. And Captain America, I apologize for not having mentioned you. Yes?
Do you miss your writing output of the old days, since your own writing, your own writing seems to be non-existent tomorrow?
I miss writing very much, and I wish I had the time to do it. What's happened is I'm involved in a number of screenplays and writing some books. And, yeah.
Did you have one that was going to be directed by Alain Resnais?
We're still working on it. It's called The Inmates. In fact, Alain just did the movie Stavisky. He was busy on that, and he's coming to the States to see me in a month or two, and we're going to get started again. Actually, we have so many really talented younger writers at Marvel. Sometimes I feel it almost isn't fair. Why should I hog all the stories? I've had my day. Give them a chance. And it's fun to try new things. Yes. Well, it's a little bit of a long story, but if you'll bear with me. Years ago, we used to refer to the competition as Brand X. Then some writers who wrote letters to us started referring to them as Brand Ech, E-C-H-H. And it was kind of a cute name, so we started referring to them as Brand X. After a while, it occurred to me we were making the name Brand Ech very popular and very famous. Everybody knew it. And I said to the guys in the office, you know, if our competition had any brains, they'd bring out a magazine called Brand Ech, because we've been publicizing the name for years. It would probably sell. So I said, let's beat them to it. So we decided to put out a book called Not Brand Ech, and it was like Mad Magazine, and we did spoofs and parodies of their stories and even of our own stories. And it sold well, and people seemed to like it. But after about 8 issues or so, it was like one gag being continued, and we got a little bit bored with it, so we dropped it. Yes?
I have one psychological question.
I'll give you a psychological answer.
Peter Parker has enough problems without Aunt May hanging around.
You know, it's incredible how bloodthirsty some of our readers are. Now, there's this poor, dear, sweet Aunt May who's never harmed a fly. We get about 100 letters a week. When are you going to kill off Aunt May? I don't know. Maybe you're right. Maybe we'll kill her off someday. I don't think so, though.
Why are you doing so many reruns?
The funny thing about these reruns,
Sorry, I don't hear you. How close is Peter to graduation? And who's this new Gwen Stacy that showed up?
oh, the new Gwen Stacy. I really shouldn't tell you.
Come on.
What happened was when I started, I told you how bloodthirsty our readers are. Some of our staff is just as bloodthirsty. When I gave up writing Spider-Man a few years ago, I gave it a guy named Jerry Conway to finish the stories. And I minded my own business. I did my own work, you know. And one day I started looking through the books, and I see that Gwen Stacy, Spider-Man's girlfriend, is dead. What are you doing? She was one of our top characters. I always wanted to kill her. All right, that was all right, but then we kept, again, getting mail from people. Hey, you gotta bring Gwen Stacy back. And but you know, when you do comics, you're a little bit like God. People say to you, I want her back alive again. So we had to find a way. Now, in the National Comics Company, at DC, if they ever want to bring anybody back, they say the last story was just a dream, and they're off the hook.
Which is to print.
I think it really makes sense. I think it could possibly happen, and I'm going to leave it to you. Stay with the book, read it, see the explanation if ever they give it, and write me a letter and let me know if you think it's okay. Over there.
All right, is she a clone? That's the question.
I thought I was being so clever and unique and original.
One other question. What are you going to do with 13 X-Men?
The same thing you do with 12. I hate you.
Here with us now is Danny Fingeroth, a longtime editor and writer for Marvel Comics, best known for his longtime stint as editor of the company's Spider-Man line of titles. He's also worked on the Fantastic Four and Iron Man. Danny has taught comics and writing and appreciation at NYU, the New School. He's a senior VP of education at New York's Museum of Comics and Cartoon Art, and he has spoken at comics venues including the Smithsonian Institute and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You can check out Danny's new book, A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee today. We are so thrilled to have him here, so without further ado, here is Danny Fingeroth.
Hi, ITHACON attendees. As you've been told, I'm Danny Fingeroth, the author of A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. I just happen to have a copy of it here. This is the book. It is now out in paperback from St. Martin's Press. I did the audiobook on it. And I've been asked to do some commentary on the 1975 Ithaca College lecture by Stan. So I've gone through it and made notes. I want to give you some overall background, because I think a lot of people, especially if you're not somebody who's obsessed with the inner workings of Marvel Comics and Marvel Studios and Stan Lee's life and the lives of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, who were his main co-creators of the major Marvel characters, Spider-Man and the Avengers and the X-Men and Hulk and so on, Iron Man. There are myths wrapped in misapprehensions mixed in with outright stretchings of the truth to a very thin degree. So it's 1975 when Stan comes up to Ithaca. He's been speaking at colleges for 10 years. He started in 1964 with an appearance at Bard College. And he's also doing a lot of speaking at comic conventions. As a matter of fact, right around this time, he kind of segues out of the campus appearances and is doing more and more convention appearances. I guess he figures he can get to more people and maybe get paid better for showing up. But he's at Ithaca College. You know, he lives in New York City. Ithaca is about a 5-hour drive from New York. And it's 1975. It's about 14 or 15 years since Fantastic Four #1, which is considered the beginning of the modern Marvel age. You know, that was followed shortly by Spider-Man and the X-Men and the Hulk and the Avengers, Daredevil. All that happened within about a 2-year period. I mean, it was very concentrated. And but it's, and Marvel has done well. They had been huge in the 40s and 50s. Then for various reasons, they imploded and became a very small company. And the comic book business was having a lot of trouble because of horror comics that were raised a lot of controversy, and a lot because the existence of television, which was a new thing and suddenly was this endless supply of free entertainment that you could have directly in your house. So you can imagine that something like comics would take a big challenge. So comics have been sold on newsstands, which which aren't as plentiful now as they were, but a newsstand or a stationery store or a drugstore or some kind of place where you could buy magazines and periodicals, including comic books. That market was taking a hit because comics maintained a low price so that children could buy them, but therefore they couldn't compete with magazines that were charging $1 or $2 or $3 in terms of what a retailer would find desirable to put on their shelves. In the direct market, the comic book shop was only just at the very beginning. So comic sales and circulation were taking a big hit. Marvel's future, Stan saw his future and Marvel's future as being more in Hollywood, with cartoons, maybe with movies, although it would be years before any of the major movies came about. But Stan had made himself the voice and face of comics and was doing a lot of public speaking to promote Marvel, but really to promote his own career. He was always, from day one, ambivalent about even being in the comic book business. He says at one point, in a very friendly tone of voice, he says, "I hate teenagers, I hate superheroes, I hate comics." I don't know if he hated teenagers. I think he liked young people, and he had a teenage. Well, I guess his daughter was in her 20s. I don't think he gave a damn. I don't think he gave a damn about superheroes, and I think he hated comics. But he had kind of stepped into a gold mine, or helped create this gold mine, and here he was in this business that he spent years and years trying to get out of, coming up with ideas for movies, coming up with ideas for syndicated comic strips, which were much more profitable and much more respectable when newspapers were huge. I'm not saying he was miserable. He was in a pretty good position. He worked himself up to be publisher. But every time you hear Stan speak, there's always some shocking thing like that, his mission in particular was to sell a book he'd just written called Origins of Marvel Comics. That was one of like 4 or 5 books like that Stan had written. And of course, so he, and his version and some other background. Some of you may know all this. Some of you may just know the lovable guy from the cameos and the movies and TV shows. He talks about, I created this, Spider-Man. There's a lot of debate. Obviously Stan was not an artist. He was a writer, an editor, art director. He moved up in the company to be publisher. My collar is a big problem here. And so to this day, as many of you know, the idea of who literally created, in the collaborations between him and Jack Kirby and the collaborations between him and Steve Ditko, who created what and who created how much of it and who contributed what, comics or Marvel movies or the Marvel juggernaut. And including a guy named Martin Goodman, who was Stan's cousin, who was the original owner of the company. So Stan was a complicated guy, and like all of us are, but he, I just think of him just as simply the lovable grandpa, from the movie cameos, or even the, is missing a big part of the picture. You know, it clearly seemed to me he was enjoying himself. But who was he talking to? Who's the audience in 1975 at Ithaca College, right? It's the grown-up, it's the college, there are a few little kids in the audience, tell by the questions, but it seems to me, based on the questions, it's mostly people like, who were then your age, who were, dare I say it, part of the dreaded baby boom generation. So Stan was taking these grown up into their, say, late teens and early 20s kids, people who've been kids when Marvel first came out. These were people like me, because I'm around, that would have been when I was in college. He's taking the students, the young adults of Ithaca College on a nostalgia trip. He's taking them by the hand on a journey through their childhoods, to entertain them, but also to sell them stuff, to sell them Marvel comics, to sell them Stan Lee's books, to sell them the idea of Marvel. And I'm sure he's getting a speaker's fee too, at that point. So, and none of which is, bad, wrong, terrible. But I mean, just sort of to try to place it for you, why Stan got in his car and drove the 5 hours each way, to when he was a very busy guy. This is setting the stage. So I hope that's helpful. In case people are wondering, I've been to Stan's archives in Wyoming, and there are many, there are recordings, both video and audio, of many different talks and lectures he gave. What I find interesting about this one, a lot of things, but I'll go through it, is his pattern would become, especially in later years, would be he'd show up at a place and he'd say, I had some pre-prepared remarks, but I'm just going to throw them away and just take questions. And then someone would look at the paper that he'd thrown away, and it was blank. So in a lot of cases, his intention never was to make a speech or give a talk, but to just go to questions. And you can hear, and if you've seen Stan live, he's very entertaining. He's a ham and an actor by nature. So he very much, so in later years, I would think even in this period, he would have been more about just responding to questions. But I guess he had the agenda of selling the book. Also, that there had been as he speaks about, there had been a Marvel convention at a hotel in New York. The Commodore, I think, is on 42nd and Lexington. It's got a different name now. It had several different names and renovations. And this was when the San Diego Con was just starting. It was like 5 years. So the San Diego Con was not as big as it was. The New York convention that you may know from the Javits Center didn't exist yet. There were this guy, the same guy who helped or really created or was very much part of creating the direct market, the comic book shop market, Phil Suling, was also behind the beginnings of the big comic book conventions. And Marvel figured out, well, if people will come to a comic book convention in general, why don't we have one that's branded Marvel? And it's interesting. So Stan says we had 10,000 kids. So in other words, Marvel is still looking at itself as a children's publishing company. It's got teenage and adult fans, and it's very much aware of them, and it's always tried to cater to them. But the people who came to this convention, when Stan says kids, I think he means it was mostly people between, say, 10 and 15 years old. And he says, I don't have a structured speech. But he clearly did have a structured speech, because he didn't go, maybe he didn't have it written down, but he certainly had done enough appearances that he knew what he was talking about. He has news about Jack Kirby, who he's a little mean to in the beginning of the talk. He kind of does a, good-natured, but kind of a little mean imitation of Kirby giving one-word guttural answers to any questions Stan asked him. Well, Kirby was very articulate and very smart, but I think Stan needed and wanted to establish himself as the boss, as the smartest guy in the office, if not the smartest guy in the room. He makes no mention of Steve Ditko, who had left the company years before and would eventually come back. He talks about his book, Origins of Marvel Comics, which is on sale wherever quality books are sold. And he even, he makes a point of talking about how the people at the famous J. Walter Thompson advertising agency told him that Marvel is like one big advertising campaign. What he didn't tell you, or but anybody there could figure out, is part of that advertising campaign was speaking at Ithaca College. It's to spread the word about Marvel, but to also spread the word about himself as a public speaker, as a possible producer or even actor in movies and TV shows. And the way he's doing that is he's talking about how Marvel began, and obviously it's a self-selected group who's say 20 years old, which means 10 or 15 years before you were a child reading Marvel comics, and if you've come to this lecture, they must hold someplace in your heart. And Stan is using that to bond with the audience, and in some ways it's kind of idealistic, but definitely to sell them stuff. And why not? They talks about the convention and about the Marvel, the rec, and about the origin. So he talks about the origins of the characters, the origins of the fan clubs, how that they had 10,000 kids at the convention. And then he tells this incredible story. Okay, let me put this again in context. 1975, bomb threats were a really common thing in America, especially in cities like New York. A lot of it having to do with politics of various kinds, both in America and internationally. For all I know, there've been bomb threats at Ithaca College. I don't know. Maybe somebody there can look through their old newspaper files and see. Stan tells this story about a bomb threat that I've never heard before or since. Oh, excuse me, my ride is here. I am actually in Washington Heights in Manhattan, which is the neighborhood Stan grew up in, and so you will hear occasional traffic noise. I apologize. So Stan tells this story about a bomb threat. Somebody calls him in his hotel in England. He's there promoting the British Marvel comics, which are actually where I got my start at Marvel. That we put out comics specifically for England, but that's a digression. And then there's this whole story about him and a bunch of detectives, and there's two teams of detectives, one from New York and one from Boston, and they finally, what the story does have is a happy ending. They catch the guys, the perpetrators who've planted the bombs. It's not clear whether they actually have planted a bomb or not, but certainly they get people who, I think, told Stan where to leave the ransom money. So it's an incredible story, right? I mean, this is like a bonus. And I don't think Stan made up, but I bet he was terrified. So I mean, I found that in some ways the most interesting part of the event, that Stan, was talking that he just had this bomb scare story that was very relevant in the 70s. As I say, there were, I went to Marvel a couple of years later to work, and we evacuated the office of the building, I'd say once a month, with bomb scares, that luckily never turned out to be anything real. But that was the thing. So that's a great story. And of course, Stan is a storyteller, so he structures it in a way that, he keeps it lighthearted, but it's a pretty scary story, especially to be telling, while the audience did seem to be mostly adults, or young adults, there were, you could tell by the questions, a bunch of children there. So I wonder if those kids were were freaked out, or their parents. So then he gets the Q&A, and he's talking about this will be a full-length Spider-Man movie by Steve Krantz, whose wife, by the way, was Judith Krantz, who wrote all those romance novels, if any of you ever heard of those. And Krantz was involved with a lot of different things with Stan and Marvel. Obviously, this live-action Spider-Man movie directed by John Hubb and written by Brian Klamis, I think the name was. And he says, where Stan says, there's a slight chance I may get to play Jonah Jameson. Well, that didn't happen. And a couple of years later, the Spider-Man TV show happened with Nicholas Hammond. I'll be the associate producer. Okay, now as far as Jack Kirby. Now here's the thing about Jack Kirby. Kirby and Stan co-created all the Marvel characters except Captain America, Spider-Man, and Doctor Strange. Everything else, X-Men, Fantastic Four, Avengers, Hulk, Iron Man, all created by some combination of Stan and Jack, sometimes with Stan's brother, Larry Lieber, also contributing as writer. And as Stan says, Jack created most of our characters with me. Says he's a top artist. He doesn't say that Jack did a lot of the plotting on the stories, did a lot of the conceptual work. You know, Stan very much wants to maintain himself, and Stan was a very creative guy. You know, I mean, that's I think people don't give him enough credit for that, but you know, certainly with these characters, he wants, especially with this book coming out that tells the official Marvel story and the official Stan story. Stan wants for a minute. Can you hear me?
Sorry, my internet cut out, but yes, I can hear you.
Okay, well, mine internet is not so great either. So Stan announces Jack Kirby is coming back, which is a big deal. Kirby had left 5 years earlier, mostly because he didn't like the way he was being treated by Stan and by Marvel. But again, they had a complicated relationship, a sort of a love-hate thing. But as bad as he might have felt treated at Marvel, apparently he felt even worse treated at DC because he came back to Marvel, where he had certain ground rules. He would not, you know, work on any of his old characters. He wanted to be left to sort of his own playground on the fringes of the Marvel universe and not have to tie into anybody else's continuity. So Stan says, Jack left Marvel 5 years ago, quote, for reasons which no one has ever understood competition, but you know, in the days before the internet, not many people knew that. You know, there was no internet, there were a few fanzines. It wasn't even the Comics Journal yet. There was no Wizard magazine, if you remember Wizard. I mean, Stan could say stuff, you know, and why would he not make it look there's no reason he would not want to make himself and Marvel look as good as possible. But you know, his presentation is a very heavily polished public relations piece or advertising piece, which, you know, again, I don't say that in a pejorative way. That's what he was there to do. He says, I met with Jack last week. He signed a new contract. And then here's what he says, again, humorously, but there's a little edge to it. So the defector has returned. That's pretty intense to defector, you know, and this is in the middle of the Cold War when there's all sorts of, you know, people defecting from, you know, Russia to America and America to Russia. To say the defector has returned, you know, I doubt it was pre-planned. It sounded like it was a spontaneous wisecrack. That's a pretty heavy thing. You know, it's not like the genius has returned or my friend has returned or the greatest artist in the history of comics has returned. The defector has returned. And then he talks about what some of Jack's projects are going to be. And then brags a little bit about some of his own writing. I turned Captain America into sort of a Hamlet. And in the crazy neurotic world of today, it caught on. He tells, you know, and then, you know, he's actually very frank about the fact that even though he's now publisher, And believe me, he was thrilled to not have to be editing or writing comics on a daily basis. That he'd done that for 35, 40 years already, since he was 17 years old. I'm just an employee, but he's the publisher, so he's pretty high up on the food chain, although there are corporate levels above him, as there always were. And he talks about, this is pretty sincere, again, the surfer was a character that he always credited Kirby with creating, and yet nonetheless, Stan took a real affection for the character and took it in directions that I don't think Kirby liked. And it was for about 20 years, Stan had pretty much mandated that he was the only one who could write New Adventures of the Silver Surfer, which he didn't do with any other character. But there was something about that character. And he talks about that maybe he and Jack Kirby will do a hardcover book project, which they did. I don't know if it got to be hardcover, but a few years later, they did do a Silver Surfer graphic novel. He says, I miss writing comics very much. Maybe that moment he did, but I just, and I worked with him. I edited Stan, which was a surreal thing in my career. He's working with Alain Resnais, the French filmmaker Alain Resnais. Look him up if you don't know who he is. He was a French art filmmaker. He made Hiroshima Mon Amour, is his most famous movie. He just died a couple of years ago as well. He's one of those celebrities who passed through Marvel that became actually very good friends with Stan. It was interesting. And they worked on several movies together, none of which ever came out, but Stan wrote a screenplay and a treatment with Alain. And they always spoke very highly of each other, even for the next 40 years or more. And then he talks about, somebody asked him why he's not writing more stories, and he said, why should I hog all the comic stories? I've had my day, let the new talented guys do the writing. Well, that sounds actually sincere and generous, although, combined with the fact that he had pretty much had his fill of writing comics. So he would do some more over the years. This is very funny. X-Men was a medium seller. X-Men was never a big hit until just about the period of this talk. It had been almost canceled, and it had just gone to reprints of older X-Men stories. Obviously, this is 25 years before the X-Men movies. He says we're starting to do some new X-Men stories, and what he's talking about is the beginning of the famous Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum and Chris Claremont and John Byrne eras of X-Men, which became the basis for the cartoons and the movies, and for what's considered the greatest run of X-Men. So this is literally just beginning. So you're sort of hearing Stan. He's not hyping it much because he doesn't know if it's going to be big. Just we're starting to do some new ones. Then the last thing, major thing on the tape is the story of Gwen Stacy, the death of Gwen Stacy, which was very controversial, in the Spider-Man books. And this story is pretty much completely not true that Stan tells. He didn't want to take responsibility with the fans who hated the idea. So, it was either John Romita or Jerry Conway, Romita Sr., who was the artist, and Jerry Conway, who was the writer. And it's, and it's pretty much impossible he didn't know and didn't approve. It's pretty much impossible he didn't know about or didn't approve the death of Gwen Stacy. I guess he had no idea how controversial it would be. And so this story about he hadn't been reading the books for a while, and he opened it one day, and oh my God, what did you guys do? Is complete fiction. In a way, it actually doesn't that good, because if he's supposed to be the publisher and the guy running things, how could he not know? It sort of makes him look a little bit asleep at the switch. But for him, I think it was more important that day and in that period, and really for years after, A, to tell a good story, and B, to put the blame this on somebody else. It kind of reminds me, uh, right around this period, he was doing a kind of a semi-underground comic called Comics Book with someone named Dennis Kitchen, a famous underground publisher and cartoonist. And, they were trying to take advantage of the popularity of the underground comics, which had levels of sex and violence that a Marvel comic couldn't, but they were trying to push the envelope a little, and do a co-publishing venture. And Dennis asked Stan what he wanted his credit to be, publisher, editor-in-chief, it would be instigator. Because that way, if it was well received and sold well, he could say, well, I instigated it. But if it was a flop, and then it didn't do well or it drew criticism, you go, well, all I did was instigate it. That's so that's my commentary on the talk. I know it sounded like I went a little negative, but I actually admire how Stan was able to be a public figure and take Marvel, which was even then a pretty small company in an industry that was in big trouble. An industry looked like it was going away. Again, it's hard to imagine now, certainly that those characters or the medium itself was in danger. And there'll always be comics, of course, because people love comics, but comics as a mass medium that every child was reading was starting to end in that period. And just even if you wanted them, to find them for the reasons I described before was getting harder and harder, and comic shops hadn't really, and there was certainly no no collections of comics in bookstores. That was a pipe dream, that hadn't started at all in any meaningful way. There were collections of, say, Peanuts, like Charles Schultz's Peanuts or Little Abner or Dick Tracy, but there was nothing like this on any kind of scale for comic books or superheroes. So I think Stan, as a cheerleader for both himself and for the business and for Marvel, was doing exactly what he had to do with this talk. And he, so it was, like I said, an interesting phase. And I'm glad somebody made the recordings.